both of you. Before we get into remarks, a question. When we say smart city, what does it mean in Canada, Jennifer, and in Italy, Francesco, please.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you to the ambassador. We were talking about this seminar in the beginning of the year, and I was really impressed by the design of the day. I don't like the word smart city, because I think all the cities are smart in some way. The problem is that today the cities are changing. You know maybe that since the year 2010, more than 50% of the world population moved in cities. The cities are completely different. I was talking with ambassador in Vancouver. More than 48% of the population of the city is from people that they have not born in Vancouver. They come from different countries, and you understand what it means. The third point is that we have a new cities. The ambassador was talking about the China urbanization process. In the meantime, if you go to Rome, you understand what is a city where we have more than 2,000 years of history. This means that to talk about the city, I think we needed to go in the other side, looking from the citizen point of view. What they want to have a citizen today? They want to have a friendly city. This means that the city is closer to the citizen, to the needs of the citizen, to what they ask. The city has to be able to understand what the population, the citizen, want to have. It's not easy. I don't know if there are here some mayors. Yes, I was talking yesterday night with a lady from Canada. She was a mayor for a long time. Maybe she can understand. And first of all, cities, they have to be more friendly. Second, we are facing day by day, the city has to be more careful or more attentive to what we can call welfare. If we go around the city, we understand, at least in Europe, that the situation is much worse than it was a few years ago. And probably the welfare system that we use till now is not enough to give an answer the needs of people in general and the new people coming in the city for sure. The third point is that for a long time we didn't put enough attention to what means to have a sustainable city, in the sense that the design of the city is not tied to relate to what could be the future of the city. And the last point is that today the number of data that are generating inside the city is increasing, but in most of the case we don't use this data. We don't use it because we don't have enough infrastructure, we don't have enough culture, we don't have enough skills. This means that we have a richness in what the city is generating, and this richness could be used for not only manage the city, but also to look inside the city. Maybe I can stop here.
Well, thank you very much to the Canadian Embassy for inviting me to be here today. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here in Rome. And in order to answer the question, I'd like to break with the format already, just a little bit, and show a few slides because I'd like to frame this question of what is smart by thinking about some of the fundamental principles of great city building, because at a very basic level, if we don't get the fundamental principles of city building right first, there's really no technological fix. There is no way that we can bring in infrastructure that will remediate the kinds of places that are going to be livable in the long term. So a critical part of creating a smart city, from my perspective, and of course I come from this conversation not from analytics and data, but from a placemaking lens, from the question, as my colleague has implied, the question of how do we make friendly, livable cities, places where people are going to thrive over the long term. So just a few slides just to point out some of the fundamental tenets that I believe we need to get first right in order to build a smart city. The City of Toronto, for those of you who are unfamiliar, of course, is in the North American context. You can see there's a little key map on the bottom there. We are the country above America, not a part of America. And you can see right in the center of that slide, there's some darker areas. Those are the 5 Great Lakes. We actually live in the largest freshwater region in the entire world. And Toronto is right in the very center, very close to the American border. You mentioned Vancouver, but in fact in Toronto as well, 49% of our population is foreign-born. So this is one of our greatest assets, that there's a tremendous amount of diversity. And we are also one of the most densely populated regions in the Toronto context. One of the questions with respect to smartness in the City of Toronto and in our region is how we get density right. You cannot, for example, provide broadband to a neighborhood if you don't have the right density, if your density is too low, or even if your density is too high. So getting density right is a critical part of creating a livable city. Part of how we're seeking to do this is through regional planning. What you see here right in the center of this map is in fact the City of Toronto. The yellow parts are the built-up area. The green parts are our green belt. We have an urban green belt of approximately 2 million acres. That is a swath of land that redirects our growth into the built-up urban area. And this is a critical part of creating an intensified urban region with densities that allow for walkability and that allow for a more intensive kind of infrastructure. We also recognize that a critical part of what we need to do in the North American context is shift our planning paradigms and to focus on planning places for people. Anyone who's been to North America knows that we've spent the past generation planning around cars. We travel vast distances on a daily basis. Our environmental footprint on an individual basis is very large. Large homes on large lots that spread out over large distances. Part of the green belt is about beginning to create a more compact urban region. If we want to, for example, have evac systems where we have waste disposal through vacuum systems in our downtown core, it's not going to work if we are very spread out, simply because it costs too much to provide that infrastructure. So linking up the density with creating places for people is a very important part of our transformation. This is in fact a community that we're building out right now. It is right in great proximity to our downtown core. This is land that was industrial that is now becoming a community place where we're focusing on adding a high quality pedestrian realm. You can see just in the distance the CN Tower. This is within 10 kilometers of the downtown core. So looking at our lands that are in close proximity to the downtown and identifying how we can transform those lands for a more advanced kind of urbanism, more advanced kinds of uses, is a critical part of answering this question of smartness. We also recognize that to densify at the right scale, we need to better use our existing assets. This is the distillery district in the downtown, which is a Victorian-era National Historic Site in the Canadian context that is a combination of uses that we've mixed up in a really significant way. It includes community spaces, universities, residences, artisan shops, mixing up these uses in an existing urban form and adapting this to be a place no longer for industry, but now for people, is a critical part of transforming to being a smart city in the future. We also recognize the importance in smartness of what is called urban repair. How can we transform the planning mistakes of the past? Now, this might be truly a North American problem. I'm not sure that it exists in the same way in the Italian context, but for us, part of being smart is looking at those planning mistakes we've made in the past and identifying how we can transform them. So you see here single-family homes and towers in a suburban context. We're now transforming this. You can see here a site plan for a specific community where we are infilling to begin to define a pedestrian realm, places where we have infill buildings. The white, taller buildings are the existing buildings. We're now defining street edges and public spaces by adding infill, by adding new rental housing, new affordable housing, new community spaces, new spaces for gathering, and this is all on the terminus of one of our new metro or new subway lines. Regent Park is another example of a community that is in the process of urban repair. We are taking down the old buildings and we're building new communities with new streets, a combination of low-rise buildings, mid-rise buildings, and tall buildings that includes an emphasis on affordable housing. This, in fact, was a very poor community with a tremendous amount of social unrest, and the objective has been to add market housing and to add new built forms and new public spaces so that this, in fact, becomes a very livable community. And this is an example of some of the commercial that's been added into the community environment. We also recognize urbanizing our avenues, and I'm embarrassed to show you the next slide, but this, in fact, you don't see the transition here, but this is a typical strip mall or big box power center where you would see very low-rise uses. And we're transforming this kind of an environment. This is what it looks like today, transforming this environment to become a mid-rise urban community. This is the plan that we approved approximately 2 months ago at City Council to add a variety of ways of movement, cycling lanes, widened sidewalks, LRT on the green band down the middle, and mid-rise building to repair the urban environment to add density that now allows for long-term sustainability. And lastly, we recognize a critical part of smart cities is transforming the conversations that we have about our cities. We need to build capacity and build understanding around city building in new ways. And there's a variety of ways we're doing this. We're focusing on large-scale neighborhood planning and inviting communities into that conversation. I host chief planner roundtables in City Hall where we bring in outside experts from a whole variety of disciplines, universities, the private sector, the not-for-profit sector, to problem solve on our most critical issues, such as how we're planning for climate change. We also have an initiative called Planners in Public Space, where we go into the public spaces in the city and we plan with communities right in their neighborhoods for transformation. And then lastly, we're looking at how we draw new Canadians, those 49% who are foreign born, into the conversation to create broad buy-in for community change. So as a way of introduction, those are some of the ways that we're thinking about smart cities from a planning lens right at the outset.
Thank you very much. You can do it. Yeah. That's great. I'm sure that will be some remarks, question, or comment from the room in a few minutes. Before that, I turn to Francesco for some opening remarks. You have some slide, probably? No? It's okay.
I don't like to use slides because I feel that we needed to have a kind of discussion on today. The topic is quite interesting, and in the meantime is changing almost day by day what we have from the field. Just one point. When we wake up in the morning, in the first hour, we have at least 5 or 6 actions that are tightly related with public services. The first action is to turn on the light. Maybe the second is to use water. The third one is to get a coffee. This means to use the gas. The next one is that we create waste in some way. Then during the winter or during the summer, we use some heating or some air conditioning. And most of the time when we go to school or we go to work, we use a public transportation. Then if we go through, we really use at least 6 public services. Until now, the services are in some way separate one from the other. In some way, we have some kind of conflict related to this. In the meantime, there is no feedback related to what we are doing and what could be that we can use starting from our habits to get better services. Just to give you an idea, if we look in our house, we generate a great numbers of data. In Italy, we have more than 35 millions of smart meters that are able to get the data related to our consumption of energy. In the meantime, you know that in Italy we started a program to have smart meters also for gas and for water and for the heating district. This means that in general, we are creating more and more data. But these data are completely separate. There is no interaction till now. In the meantime, if we look inside our house, we have a TV set, and this means that we have maybe a cable TV or we have a digital TV. In the meantime, we have the telephone and we have a ADSL. This means that we again have data. And there is a kind of confusion. This means that seems to me that we have some like a multiple layers with a separate data, but there is no way to get a vertical axis where we can connect all this data. I really appreciate your presentation, but I feel that for the future, urban planning is not anymore enough. I come from a city where we had a great urban planning, was started 20 years ago. We had a good results. Just to give you an idea, the transition from the industrial city, as it was Torino, to a multiple service, multiple operation service like we have today, it lasted 20 years. But today, we are looking for the next generation of planning. This means another 20 years, maybe. And we have a long discussion in the city. We just approve what we call the strategic plan for the metropolitan city. And we are thinking that we needed to have some extra instrument for designing the new city. And one of the instruments is how to use all the data that we generated during the day. Just to give an example, for the distribution network for the energy, what we have today is a one-layer network is for the power line, and we have just one unidirectional network. This means that the energy is moving from where we produce energy to where we use energy. But if we look today for a few, but in the future more and more, what we have that each citizen could be producer and consumers. This means there is a new type of citizen that we can call prosumers. But in the meantime that you go to this direction, the single layer distribution network is not anymore enough. You need to have at least two levels. One is for the power flow. The second one is for the intelligence. This means for the data that is connected to this. And then the network could not be anymore just in one direction flow, but has to be bidirectional. Because in sometimes you are producing, sometimes you are consuming. This means that you needed to integrate, this is just only one example, but you needed to integrate these new aspects of infrastructure in the urban planning. You were talking the INVAC system. In the meantime, if you talk about the heating district, is again a very large infrastructure that is changing the life of the citizen. And you are right when you say that maybe it's not possible to design just only very large city, because in the other way the cost of this type of infrastructure is too large, it's impossible. And then this means that you needed to go in any details to understand if you can design only one infrastructure, or maybe it's better just to subdivide the city in sub-cities and to design in a different way. Then I have the feeling that both inside the house, that outside of the house, we are going to have a great revolution. And the revolution is to try to forecast what the citizen could need to have a better life. And people today expect that the administrations, or in general, who is taking care to the city, not only from the administration point of view, is able just not to wait for the explicit needs of the citizen, but just to try to go in advance and to try to just prevent more than to give an answer. It's very difficult, I understand. But today, I have the feeling that this is what means to have a friendly city. The city has to be able just to prevent. And in order to prevent, you need to start when you design the new city. Because, as I said, for a transformation of a city like Torino, 1 million people, that was 100% an industrial city to a completely different city, where we have really a cultural city, university city, services cities, that is a combine. We need about 20 years. But today, the time basis is completely changed. And the last point is that we cannot design the new city starting from technology. You know, this stuff is something that is the result of maybe the last 20 years of research. And today we have about 10 billion of objects that they have some intelligence inside, some way. In the year 2020, we are going to have maybe 50 billion. And I'm sure that they will be completely different from today. Today, we feel that this kind of stuff are part of our life, but 3 years ago, we are completely different. Some of this stuff were not on the table. What we can have in 5 years from now?
Thank you. Well, next generation of planning then is what he said. And you make some plan for Toronto, but also from other cities, right? Do you see some difference among those, some challenge to face?
So it's interesting, you know, it's an interesting question when we talk about smart cities. We almost have to go back to the question of what are cities for? What are we doing in cities? What's the objective of cities? And at a very basic level, cities are places for humanity to thrive. And technology becomes a tool to facilitate that thriving. And if we ask, you know, I like this analogy that, you know, it's been 20 years. When I went to university, which was 20 years ago, email didn't exist yet. There's no email. There was no such thing. It's inconceivable now. How did we get around without email? But we did. We got degrees, and we did great work without email. So this notion that the idea of the city, and it's wonderful to be speaking about this in a place like Rome, is something that has a very, very long history. And if you take the technology away, the essence of the city continues to be places of commerce, places of living, places where people thrive, and the systems that is built upon have nothing to do with that little tool we've had for the last 20 years, because civilization has organized itself for thousands of years based on principles that have nothing to do with that technology. And those principles have to do with public spaces. How we design public space has a profound impact on whether our cities are creative places where there's human interaction. So the notion of the square is something that, if we look back historically, is a critical, timeless principle of urbanism. The importance of a public square for public gathering, for commerce, for sharing of information, for artistic and cultural activity is something that has existed for thousands and thousands of years, and I believe will continue to exist. The risk that we face, of course, is that we are tantalized by certain technologies or tools as being more important than those timeless principles of urbanism. And I would argue that many of the mistakes that I was describing in the North American context that we are now trying to solve are precisely because we disconnected our city design from timeless principles of urbanism, and we thought that technology could replace great city building. We thought that we could organize ourselves around technology, the most important technology in our cities, as we've been maturing in the North American context, has of course been around the car. So we organized our cities around a new technology, which was the car, and that led to the disintegration of some of the most important parts of an urban conglomeration that are critical to a city thriving. All of a sudden, our uses became disconnected. People became disconnected, and we lost the opportunity for creativity in our cities. So that's one of the reasons why going back to those principles of timeless urbanism, from my perspective, is such a critical part of the forefront of smart cities. And technology then becomes a layer that we embed Once we have those principles of timeless urbanism in place, then technology becomes a layer that helps us facilitate really squeezing the most or getting the most out of our urban places. In the cities that I've worked at, the problems, you know, in cities around North America and in many cities of the world are the same. The problems are very similar. How can people afford to live? Affordable housing. How can technology solve affordable housing? That's a critical question that we need to ask, because affordable housing is a critical issue in every major city in this world. And as we rapidly urbanize, ensuring that people have access to very basic amenities like water and electricity is going to be the most critical question of our time. We have cities of millions and millions of people where people do not have steady access to electricity. That's a critical problem of our time that we must struggle with and we must answer. How do we find the money that we need to invest in key infrastructure, whether it is our heritage buildings or our streets or our public transit? Cities around the world struggle with that question of investing in key infrastructure. How do we ensure that we have long-term, meaningful employment for every generation? That's a critical question, and technology can help us answer that. But the way we design our cities will help us answer that as well. And then another critical question that exists in great cities around the world is, how do we raise families? How can we ensure that we're creating urban places where it's possible to raise families and raise children in an urban environment in a way that is affordable, that is safe, where children can thrive? And that is another critical question, and it's of course linked to the question of access to education. But I think in any city around the world, when we're master planning, we see those same questions repeated again and again, of course with different nuances from place to place.
Thank you, Jennifer. Can we say the same thing for Italian cities, in your opinion? And you said about citizen prosumer, so producer and consumer. Can we say also that citizens are censors just because they have this?
Before to answer to your question, I want to point out one element that was not in our discussion, is finance. She's right when she says that we need investment. But if we look at the public services and we invest in infrastructures in general, through this infrastructure we can reduce the cost. I give you an example. If we use LED technology for the lighting public system, for example, you can reduce the cost something between 50 to 70%. This means that if you just replace one traditional lamp with an LED lamp, and you add the cost of the apparatus and the energy that is used, in 10 years, for example, for a 60-watt lamp, you can go from under 30 euro in the case of a traditional lamp, starting from 10 euro for the cost of the lamp, to 34 euro if you go to the LED. This means that if you look in this long term, you understand that it's really possible to save not only money, but save in terms of production of CO2. This means to have more attention for the health to the people, to in terms of power generations. This means to use less oil or gas, or it's really a complex system. But what we needed to understand that is that the traditional finance system is not able just to understand what is happening. In the meantime, at least in Italy, but I'm sure that also in other parts of the world, the public administration are almost bankrupt. then they don't have money. Then we needed to face the problem of new financing policy that is able in some way to just look forward. Could be like a form of different insurance. Is insurance like for the life? You invest today, and you get back the money, maybe in 10 years, coming from a part of the saving that is in place. Then I understand that it's not easy. In some cases, we started to do this in Italy, but in order to really invest in a large country, maybe we have to go to this direction. And this is really a critical point, because most of the difficulties that today we have is related to the scarcity of money in the public administration and in the investment that they can do. Going back to your question, for sure, yes, the person are prosumers, but also are actors, active actors. But not only that, because when I was saying 10 billion today, 50 billion in a few years, and if we compare with the population today is almost 7 billion. Not all the 7 billion, they have some kind of something like this, for sure. But anyhow, there is some kind of relation today between the number 10 billion and the 7 billion. This is not anymore in 5 or 6 years from now when we will have 50 billion, in the sense that the population maybe will increase 1 billion or 1.5 billion. This means that most of the intelligent object that we are going to have in sometimes will be different kind. We call machine-to-machine systems.
Right.
This means or machine to person or person to machine, and not person to person. This means that, again, we are facing a kind of revolution. And this revolution will not be anymore only in the open society, but for example, also in the factories. We are talking now about factories 4.0. This means that a new revolution and a new internal revolution, a new machine-to-machine revolution will be in the new sectors. And this is another great point too. But again, I agree with you that technology is not, technology is only a tool.
It's not the issue.
It's not the issue.
Exactly.
Today we have this kind of
Sure.
the technology. Tomorrow will be completely different.
Yes.
And one final point is how we can educate the new generations to this new culture. I don't want to talk about generation, the technology. And I have the feeling that the schools are the basic location where the new generation really can learn how to live maybe in a completely different world. It's difficult because we don't know where we are going. We don't have any kind of sure forecasting system, but this is one of the big issues that we have on the place.
Yeah.
How to design the education system for the future,
Right.
thinking that the kids that will start the school this year, the primary school, they will get a degree of the middle school in the year 2023, the high school degree in the year 2028, the university degree in the year 2033.
Yeah.
What we will have in the year 2023, if we are going to have at that time a discussion like we have today,
Yeah.
what could be
Let's
the
hope.
topic? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, we have some more seconds. No, not very much, but if there is some question or remarks, please. Just a second, there is a mic. Very short, please, because the time is done.
I'm Francesco Filippi from La Sapienza, University of Rome. I have another critical question. How do you know that your planning is for people?
Wow.
That's a great question.
Jennifer.
I think there's I think there's a couple ways. Yeah, I guess I'll give a very quick answer, but I think there's a couple of ways. And one is that if we're creating cities for people, there are places where people thrive. There are places that attract people. There are places where entrepreneurialism thrives. And there are also places where people feel connected to their communities. And there's a great risk in high-density places that people, in fact, we get the density right, but people don't feel a sense of connectedness. And people are always amazed. City of Toronto is known as being a city of neighborhoods. It's the largest city in Canada, 2.8 million people just in the city. The region is about 8 million people. In another 15 years, it'll be 10 million people. But I know all of my neighbors on my street. I know all my neighbors, I know many of my neighbors in my neighborhood. And that is very unique in a city of that size. It's something that you don't find in a city, I would argue, like New York City. So I think that a very good way to measure whether we're actually getting it right is the sense of connectedness that people have to their neighborhood around them, and the extent to which people are able to maximize their own contributions to society and their own contributions, whether it's through entrepreneurialism or volunteerism or education. So I think there are some tangible things that we can measure. I actually had a slide that shows some of the different measures that we use in the City of Toronto to evaluate our successfulness. And I think safety is something that rises the extent to which you are planning places for people as well.
You want to add something?
Maybe I can say, you know that Aristotle, a few years ago,
Just you.
he was saying that the city are the location where the people go. But the city are good city if is the place where the people stay in a long term. And if we look back in the history, we have several cases with a very large city that completely disappeared. Then the feedback, if we are going to design is a good city, is how the people, the citizen, can react to the project that we put in place.
Thank you very much. So, thank you very much indeed. So now we had...
Excuse me.
At the finish. Oh, please, please, please.
Yes, please excuse me. My name is Florence Segal. I work with the City of Milan on an urban food policy planning. And both Toronto and Torino are involved, as well as about 40 other cities. Just to make the point that you stop at coffee, Dr. Profumo, but let's eat something else at the rest of the day. This is the Milan Expo year. And cities, what people eat in cities has an impact on all, they need all the logistics you talk about. It has an impact on the way food is produced. It has an impact on climate change. So I just think it's an additional dimension we should not forget. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, I can go on, I think. Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
indeed.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we had